"Did you like the lake house I gave you, Mom?" my son asked, smiling across the Thanksgiving table as if he had just handed me the world. And in that moment, everything I thought I understood about my life quietly fell apart. I stared at him, my fork hovering above my plate, my heart skipping in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with confusion. "What house?" I said, my voice softer than I expected, almost polite. "I never received anything." And the silence that followed felt heavier than the roasted turkey sitting untouched between us, because Daniel's smile didn't just fade, it cracked like something fragile breaking under pressure. And that's when I noticed her, Victoria, my daughter-in-law, slowly stepping closer to him, her movements too careful, her expression too composed, like someone rehearsing a reaction instead of feeling one. "I'm glad you're here with me, listening, because what happened that day didn't start with that question. It only revealed what had been hidden for far too long." The dining room smelled of cinnamon and sage, the same way it had every Thanksgiving for decades, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Not the polished wood table, not the soft clink of silverware, not even my own hands resting in my lap, thinner now, veins more visible than I remembered. Hands that had spent years raising a son who now sat across from me in a tailored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly bills. Daniel looked successful, confident, every inch the man I had prayed he would become. But as I looked at him that day, I realized success had built a wall between us, one I hadn't noticed until it was too high to climb. "That's not possible," he said, his voice tightening, already reaching for his phone like the answer could be solved with a few taps and swipes. And behind him, Victoria stood still, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the warm light, her smile faint but controlled, too controlled, as if she were holding something back, something that didn't belong in a room meant for gratitude and family. I should have said more, should have asked questions right then and there, but I didn't, because something deep inside me, something quiet and patient, told me to wait, to watch, to listen, because whatever truth was about to surface, it wasn't going to come from words alone. It was going to reveal itself in the spaces between them, in the glances they thought I wouldn't notice, in the silence that was growing louder with every passing second. Daniel was already scrolling through his phone, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts could settle. And I watched the color slowly drain from his face as each line of text seemed to contradict everything he believed to be true. "That is not possible," he said again, quieter this time, more to himself than to me, and I sat there, folding my hands together in my lap to keep them from trembling, because this was not the first time I had felt something was off. Not the first time I had told myself I was imagining things, that the distance between us was just life getting busy, that his shorter calls and rushed visits meant nothing more than success had finally claimed his time. For the past 2 years, I had learned to live with less, stretching every dollar from my modest janitorial job, choosing between refilling my blood pressure medication or paying the electric bill during the colder months, wearing the same winter coat for 3 seasons straight because replacing it simply was not an option, and yet I never complained, not to him, not to anyone, because I was proud of the man I had raised. Proud that he had built something so much bigger than the life I had been able to give him. Across the table, Victoria finally spoke, her voice smooth but just a little too quick. "Maybe there was a mix-up with the paperwork," she said, her eyes flicking toward Daniel before settling anywhere but on me, and that was when I noticed it clearly for the first time, the way she positioned herself slightly behind his shoulder, not beside him, as if guiding without being seen, as if every word she chose had already been calculated before she ever opened her mouth. Daniel looked up from his phone, confusion now mixed with something sharper, something closer to suspicion. "There are transfers," he said slowly. "Monthly payments, $1,500 every single month." And the number echoed in my mind, heavy and unreal, because that amount would have changed everything for me. It would have meant heat without worry, groceries without counting every item, doctor visits without delay, and yet I had never seen a single cent of it. I drew in a steady breath, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Daniel, I have never received any payments," I said, meeting his eyes this time, because whatever was happening here, whatever truth was beginning to surface, I knew one thing with certainty. I had not been the one living in comfort these past 2 years, and as the silence settled again, thicker now, sharper, I could feel something shifting in the room. Something invisible but undeniable. Like the first crack in a foundation that had been weakening for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. Victoria let out a soft laugh, the kind that was meant to smooth things over but only made the tension sharper. "That cannot be right," she said, stepping forward now, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's arm as if grounding him. but I noticed the way her fingers pressed just a little too firmly, like she was trying to guide not just his body but his thoughts as well. You know how these things are, transfers get delayed, paperwork gets lost, especially with properties, she added, her tone calm. But her eyes restless, flickering between his phone and the table, never quite meeting mine. Daniel shook his head slowly, still scrolling, his brows pulling together as he opened what looked like confirmation emails, documents, numbers lining up in ways that did not allow for simple mistakes. No, this was handled by my assistant, he said, more firmly now. Everything was verified, signed, processed. There are records for all of it. And the certainty in his voice hung in the air, leaving less and less room for excuses. I remained still, watching them both, because suddenly the past 2 years began to rearrange themselves in my mind. Small moments I had dismissed now returning with new meaning. The times Victoria had insisted on handling communication. The way Daniel's calls had grown shorter, more distracted, always with her voice faintly in the background. The times I had mentioned struggling, and he had responded with confusion that I had brushed aside as misunderstanding. All of it forming a pattern that I had been too trusting to see. "Mom," Daniel said, looking at me again, his voice softer but edged with something unsettled. "Are you absolutely sure you never received anything? No mail? No bank deposits, nothing at all?" And I met his gaze without hesitation this time. "I am sure," I said, steady and clear, because there was no doubt left in me about that truth, even if everything else was beginning to unravel. Victoria shifted beside him, her posture tightening almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since they had arrived, her smile disappeared completely, replaced by something colder, something calculating, as if she were quickly adjusting to a situation that had slipped beyond her control. "Maybe we should not jump to conclusions," she said carefully. "This could be a misunderstanding that we can clear up later." But her words felt delayed, like she was trying to catch up to a conversation that had already moved ahead without her. Daniel lowered his phone slowly, his eyes no longer just confused but searching, moving between the two of us as if trying to reconcile two completely different realities. And in that quiet moment, with the Thanksgiving dinner growing cold and untouched, I realized that whatever had been hidden between them was no longer buried. It was rising to the surface piece by piece, and this time, I was not going to look away. Daniel stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp enough to cut through the thick silence that had settled over the room, and for a brief moment no one moved, not even Victoria, who remained frozen beside him with her hand still lightly resting on his sleeve, as if she had not yet decided whether to hold on or let go. "I am going to call my assistant," he said. His voice controlled but tight, already dialing before either of us could respond, and I watched him walk a few steps away toward the kitchen doorway, his back straight, his posture rigid in a way I had only seen when he was under pressure, when something in his carefully structured world no longer made sense. Victoria slowly withdrew her hand, smoothing it over the fabric of her dress as if erasing the moment, then turned toward me with a smile that felt thinner now, more fragile. "He is overreacting," she said softly, but the words did not carry the same confidence as before. They sounded rehearsed, delayed, like a line delivered a second too late. I did not answer, not because I did not have questions, but because I had begun to understand something far more important, that speaking too soon would only give her time to adjust, to reshape whatever story she had been maintaining all this time. From the kitchen, I could hear Daniel's voice, low and urgent, asking questions that grew sharper with each passing second, his tone shifting from confusion to disbelief, and I imagined the responses on the other end, confirmations, dates, signatures, transfers, all aligning into a truth that could no longer be softened or ignored. I folded my hands again, resting them against the table, and allowed my gaze to drift briefly to the window, where the late afternoon light stretched across the yard in long golden lines, a quiet contrast to the tension building inside the house, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel small or uncertain. I felt still, grounded, as if something inside me had finally settled into place. Behind that calm, however, my mind continued to work, connecting moments I had once dismissed, the time Victoria insisted on handling a package that had arrived in my name, the way she had brushed off my questions about delayed mail, the subtle interruptions whenever Daniel and I tried to speak privately, each detail now carrying a weight it had not held before. Victoria shifted again, her composure beginning to show faint cracks, her fingers fidgeting with her ring, her eyes drifting toward the kitchen more often now, listening just as closely as I was, but for very different reasons. When Daniel returned, his face had changed, not dramatically, not with anger or raised voice, but with something quieter and far more telling, a certainty forming beneath the surface, and as his eyes met mine, I knew without a single word that whatever he had just learned was only the beginning of something neither of them had prepared for. But I had, even if I had not realized it until this very moment. Daniel did not sit back down when he returned to the table. Instead he remained standing, his phone still in his hand, his thumb hovering over the screen as if he was deciding whether to say something or to verify it one more time before the words became real. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but stripped of any doubt. "The transfers were made," he said, looking directly at Victoria now, not at me. "Every month on the same date for 2 years. And the way he said it, steady and precise, made it clear that this was no longer a question, it was a fact. Victoria blinked once, then forced a small breath through her nose, her posture straightening as if she were stepping into a role she knew well. "Then it must be an issue with the bank," she replied, her tone measured, controlled, but just slightly too quick. "These things happen more often than people realize." And I watched her carefully, noticing how her hands had gone completely still now, no longer fidgeting, no longer adjusting, as if she understood that every movement mattered. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead he turned his phone toward her, showing her something on the screen, an email perhaps or a document, and I saw the briefest flicker in her eyes, something sharp and involuntary, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but not before it told me everything I needed to know. "It says the account was confirmed," Daniel continued, his voice tightening just enough to betray the shift beneath his calm. "Not just once, multiple times, and it was linked to an address." He paused there, just long enough for the silence to stretch. "This address," he finished, and even though he did not need to say it, we all knew what he meant. I did not speak, I did not interrupt, because this moment did not belong to me. It belonged to the truth finally, catching up with the story that had been carefully maintained, and as I sat there, I felt something unexpected settle over me, not anger, not even hurt in the way I might have felt years ago, but a quiet clarity, as if the pieces of a puzzle I had been carrying without understanding were finally falling into place. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to respond, but no words came out right away, and in that hesitation, in that single pause where she had nothing prepared, nothing ready to deflect or redirect, the mask she had worn so effortlessly began to slip, not dramatically, not with a scene or a confession, but in the smallest way, in the loss of control over a single moment, and Daniel saw it, I could tell. By the way his expression changed, not with anger but with recognition, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. And as the room fell silent once more, I realized that whatever happened next, whatever decisions were made or words were spoken, the balance had already shifted, and it would not be shifting back. Daniel did not look at me anymore, his attention fixed entirely on Victoria, and there was something different in his expression now. Something that had not been there earlier, not confusion, not even disbelief, but a quiet, unsettling awareness, as if he was replaying every conversation, every detail he had trusted without question, and seeing it all through a different lens. "Victoria," he said slowly, his voice calm but firm in a way that left no room for distraction. "Why is the account linked to our mailing address instead of Mom's?" And the question did not come out as an accusation, but it carried weight, the kind that pressed down on the truth until it could not stay hidden any longer. She inhaled gently, straightening her shoulders as she finally met his eyes, and for a moment she looked almost composed again, almost convincing. "I told you there must be an administrative error," she replied, her tone steady but lacking the warmth she usually wrapped around her words. "Your assistant probably entered the wrong information and it just kept repeating." But even as she spoke, there was a faint hesitation between her sentences, a pause that suggested she was building the explanation as she went. Daniel did not interrupt, he simply listened, which somehow made the silence between her words louder, more exposed, and when she finished, he gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but as if acknowledging that he had heard enough to understand something deeper than the explanation itself. I remained still, my hands resting against the edge of the table, my posture unchanged, because there was no need for me to step in, no need to defend myself or prove anything. The truth was unfolding on its own, and for once I was not the one being overlooked in the room. "There is more," Daniel said after a moment, glancing back at his phone. "The deed for the lake house was signed and transferred, but the contact email listed is yours," he added, looking up again, "and this time The shift in the air was undeniable, like a door quietly closing behind a lie that had nowhere left to go. Victoria's lips pressed together, her expression tightening just slightly, and though she tried to maintain her composure, the ease she had carried earlier was gone, replaced by something more rigid, more controlled, as if she were holding everything in place by force alone. "I handled some of the paperwork because you were busy," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I was trying to help." And the sentence might have sounded reasonable under different circumstances, but here in this moment it felt incomplete, like a piece of a story that did not quite fit with the rest. Daniel's gaze lingered on her, searching, measuring, and I could see it clearly now, the shift that had already taken root inside him, the quiet realization that trust, once broken, does not shatter loudly. It erodes in silence until one day there is nothing left to hold on to. And as the room settled into that heavy stillness again, I understood that whatever came next would not be about explanations, it would be about consequences, even if none of us had said that word out loud yet. Victoria did not respond right away, and that silence, longer than any of her carefully chosen words, said more than anything she could have offered, because for the first time since I had known her, she did not seem prepared. She did not have a polished answer waiting behind a practiced smile. Daniel lowered his phone slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not harsher, but steadier, as if something inside him had settled into a new understanding. "You handled the paperwork, you confirmed the transfers, and everything is connected to you," he said, each word measured, leaving no space for interpretation. "So explain it to me clearly." And there was no anger in his tone, which somehow made it more difficult to ignore. Victoria let out a small breath, her shoulders rising and falling as she looked away for a moment toward the window, toward anything that would give her time. And when she turned back, her expression softened slightly, as if she were shifting strategies rather than answering the question itself. "I was trying to manage things efficiently," she said, her voice quieter now. "Less certain. You were busy building your company, and your mother does not always keep up with paperwork. I thought it would be easier if everything came through me first." And the explanation might have sounded reasonable to someone who did not know the full weight of what had been revealed. But here in this room it felt incomplete, like a story missing its most important chapter. I watched Daniel carefully, noticing the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his posture shifted as he absorbed her words, not reacting immediately but processing, comparing what she was saying to what he already knew. And I could see it clearly, the moment where doubt turned into something more solid, something that could not be undone. "You thought it would be easier," he repeated quietly, as if testing the sentence for truth, and then he shook his head just once, a small movement that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. "Easier for who?" he added, and the question lingered in the air, unanswered, undeniable. Victoria opened her mouth again, but this time no explanation followed, only a pause, a hesitation that stretched too long to ignore, and in that pause, the version of her that had always seemed composed, always in control, began to fracture, not dramatically, not with a confession or a scene, but with the absence of certainty, with the inability to maintain the story she had built. I remained still, my hands resting calmly in front of me, because there was nothing left for me to prove, nothing left for me to defend. The truth was no longer something I needed to uncover. It was something they were both facing. And as Daniel's gaze shifted briefly toward me before returning to her, I understood that he was no longer searching for answers, he was deciding what to do with the ones he had already found. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were leaning in, holding the weight of everything that had finally been said without ever needing to be shouted. And Daniel remained where he stood, his gaze steady, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, just fixed on Victoria with a clarity that had not existed before this moment. She shifted again, but this time there was no smooth adjustment, no effortless recovery. Only a subtle tightening in her posture, a quiet realization settling over her that the version of events she had maintained was no longer holding together, not under the quiet scrutiny that now filled the space between them. "I was protecting things," she said at last, her voice lower, softer, but not softer in warmth, softer in control, as if she were choosing each word with care, hoping to reshape the narrative into something that sounded reasonable, managing everything, making sure nothing went wrong. And for a brief second the words hung there, almost convincing, almost enough to smooth the edges of what had been uncovered, but only almost. Daniel exhaled slowly, a measured breath that seemed to steady him rather than release tension, and when he spoke there was no hesitation left in his voice. "Nothing went wrong," he repeated quietly and then added, "except that my mother never received anything that was meant for her." And the simplicity of that sentence stripped away every layer of explanation, leaving only the truth standing on its own. I did not move, did not speak, because I could feel it now, the shift that had already taken place, not loud, not dramatic, but permanent, like a line that had been crossed without anyone realizing until it was too late to step back. Victoria's eyes flickered again, this time not toward the door or the window, but toward Daniel, searching his expression for something she could still hold on to. But whatever she was looking for was no longer there, replaced by something steadier, something that did not bend as easily as before. The silence stretched again, but it was different now, no longer uncertain, no longer fragile. It was settled, grounded in something real, and as I sat there, my hands resting calmly against the table, I realized that I did not need to raise my voice, I did not need to demand anything or prove anything further, because the truth had already done the work for me. Daniel finally lowered his phone completely, letting it rest at his side. And in that simple motion I could see the decision forming, not fully spoken yet, not acted upon, but present, undeniable. And as his eyes moved briefly toward me before returning to her, I understood that whatever came next would not be rushed, it would not be emotional or impulsive, it would be deliberate, and that was something neither of them had expected, but I had learned long ago that the quietest moments are often the ones that change everything. Daniel did not raise his voice, and somehow that made everything that followed feel heavier, more final, as he took a slow step back from the table, creating a small distance between himself and Victoria that had not existed before, not physically, not emotionally, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a quiet resolve that left no room for misinterpretation. "We are not going to explain this away tonight," he said, his eyes steady, his posture composed in a way that suggested he had already moved beyond confusion and into decision. "I am going to review everything, every transfer, every document, every account," and he paused just briefly before adding, "and we are going to do it together with complete transparency," and the emphasis he placed on those last two words was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria nodded almost immediately, too quickly, her agreement coming before any real response could form. "Of course," she said, her voice returning to that familiar softness, but now it felt thinner, stretched over something that could no longer be hidden. "That is exactly what we should do." And yet her hands betrayed her, fingers clasping together just a little tighter than before, her composure no longer effortless but maintained with visible effort. I remained seated, watching quietly, because I understood something now that I had not fully accepted before, that this moment was not about confrontation, it was about exposure. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, no matter how calmly it is discussed afterward. Daniel turned toward me then, his expression gentler, but not in a way that erased what had just happened, more in a way that acknowledged it. "Mom," he said, and there was a hesitation there, not uncertainty but recognition. "I am sorry." And those two words carried more weight than anything else he could have offered, not because they fixed anything, but because they marked the moment he finally understood. I gave a small nod, not dismissing it, not fully accepting it either, just acknowledging that it had been said, because apologies, like trust, take time to settle into something real. The house grew quiet again, the untouched meal still sitting between us, but the silence no longer felt empty, it felt changed, as if something that had been quietly shaping our lives for years had finally stepped into the light. Victoria said nothing more, and for the first time since she had entered my life, she did not attempt to guide the conversation, did not attempt to fill the space. She simply stood there, listening, watching, calculating perhaps, but no longer in control. As I looked at the two of them, I realized that this was not the end of anything, not yet. It was the beginning of something far more revealing, something that would unfold piece by piece, and I found myself unexpectedly calm, because I did not need to rush it. I did not need to force anything into the open. I only needed to wait and see how far the truth would go now that it had finally been given room to surface.